Hey everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and I'm coming to you with Chapter 5 of the Absorbent Mind, the Miracle of Creation. And if you remember before, in my last video on the Absorbent Mind, I told you that this had a lot of biology in it, and biology is not my strong point. Basically, in this chapter, all I can do is kind of regurgitate what Maria Montessori said. I can't really give a lot of insight because biology is not my forte. So I can't really discern between what she's saying, like 100 years ago and what biology is saying now. However, because there are people that are smarter than me out there, I did have a chance to go and find a video that I thought was a little bit interesting on modern day biology that I think maybe you'll like. But mostly when I'm reading through this chapter, I keep thinking, oh, goodness, there's a lot of biology terms. And then I realized this must be what people feel like when I start talking about nerd stuff like Star Trek and Stargate and Star Wars and, maybe Lord of the Rings, right? So if your eyes just glazed over when I started mentioning those shows, then you probably know how I feel, how I felt reading this chapter. As soon as the biology terms come into play and I start looking at cells and all of that stuff, my eyes just glaze over and I'm like, oh, do I really have to do this? Maybe I can skip this chapter. And I thought, no, I'm going to work harder at this. I'm going to get better at biology. I'm going to have a better appreciation for all the different parts of biology. I'm going to work at that. I don't know what the mental block is with me and learning about like DNA and cells. It just doesn't fascinate me, but I respect it. I respect the fact that biology is a really cool science and that it has miraculous things in it. And for that, I am going to give this chapter some credit. So let's move on to the next slide. So my chapter starts out on page 29 of the Absorbent Mind, chapter 5, the Miracle of Creation, and it starts out with Maria Montessori maybe giving a little bit of shade. I can't be sure, but it was an interesting start to the chapter. I don't know. Decide for yourself. I'm going to read the first part, and you tell me if she's maybe throwing just a little bit of shade. She says, scientists at the beginning of the 18th century, or rather philosophers of those days, believed in a pre-formation. They thought that in the egg cell there must be a miniature man or woman already made. And if you pause for just a second, what do you think? Was she throwing shade there? Scientists, or rather philosophers, she says. Well, they're not really scientists, but it is interesting to note where science started. Science really started with that philosophy of life, right? There's a lot of guesswork going on in science that happened a long time ago. We didn't have tools like we did now to actually see what's going on. So we had to make our best guess about how the human body developed. And Maria Montessori here is saying, they were philosophers. They didn't know, and they made a guess. And of course, now, because of modern science, the advances we have made with certain tools, we've been able to figure out that wasn't correct. And she goes on to say, a doctor of medicine named G.F. Wolff, using the microscope, which had only just been invented, studied fecundated or fertilized germ cells in the eggs of chickens. He discovered that the being constructs itself. So we know through modern science that something different is going on here. And if you go to my next slide, you'll be able to see what that looks like. Continuing on, you can see I put a little diagram in here, and this diagram is from the book, The Absorbent Mind. And I thought that might help so that when we're reading through this, you have a little bit of a visual here. And Maria Montessori goes on to say, first, there is a single germ cell, which divides into two parts. You can see that on the left. These two divide into four. She says, see the drawing. And it is by this multiplication of cells that the new being comes to be formed. Naturally, the learned men arguing about pre-existence, turned on him, that is Wolff, in a fury. And poor Wolff's position became so difficult that he had to flee the country. Indeed, the founder of embryology was obliged to live and die in exile. We can see here that pattern of behavior in human history, that when this new piece of information or this new piece of science comes along, it can be very reactive. It can cause a lot of conflict when something that we've known to be or thought to be true for a really long time, and then we get this new piece of information in science and it challenges us, right? We are very conflicted by that and we don't know how to process it or integrate it into our lives. That's what happened at this time. And so this field of embryology was a very intense discovery. And you can see that it took a while for people to accept it. In fact, Maria Montessori goes on to say that although microscopes multiplied, no one else dared to investigate the secret for 50 years. So it took another 50 years before people began to go back and take a look at Wolff's work again and verify what he had seen. She said K.E. von Baer repeated Wolff's experiments, finding them correct. Everyone accepted the new truth, and a new branch of science was born, one of the most interesting, embryology. And she says of embryology as its end and aim to uncover the creative process, the way in which a body which did not exist comes to shape itself for entry into the world of the living. Every animal, every mammal, even that most marvelous of creatures, man, comes from a single first cell, to all appearances simple, like the most primitive of cells, undifferentiated and round. These germinative cells are amazing because of their smallness. That of man is no larger than 1/10 of a millimeter. On page 31, Maria Montessori goes on to say, to get an idea of this, mark a point with a very sharp pencil and put 10 such points close together, side by side. However small you can make them, a millimeter will not enclose them all. This cell develops apart from its progenitor, for it is protected and enclosed by a kind of capsule that keeps it separated from the body of the adult in which it is being carried. This is true for every kind of animal. The cell is so isolated from the parent body that the being to which it gives rise is truly the product of a germ cell itself. Viewing the germ cell through a powerful microscope, it is seen to contain a certain number of corpuscles. These have been named chromosomes. On page 31, we continue and we have a little diagram for this page, also from the Absorbent Mind. And Maria Montessori says, recently, new microscopes of greater power called ultra microscopes have enabled it to be seen that each chromosome is a kind of box containing a chain or a necklace composed of about 100 very small granules. The chromosomes open, the granules are freed, and the cell becomes a storehouse for some 4,000 corpuscles called genes. See the drawing to the right? The word gene implies the idea of a generation. It is plain that the scientific vision of the truth has not been reached solely by the help of the microscope, but because man's mind is creative. And so I think this is a really good point, because Maria Montessori did talk a lot about creativity. The mind has to be creative. We have to be able to imagine these things. So if someone hadn't imagined the idea of a microscope, we never could have had that brought that into existence. We never could have imagined we could see what's happening inside the human body unless we could have had that creativity first. So that prerequisite for scientific understanding is creativity. It is imagination. And in the Montessori environment, we do cultivate that. And that's a whole different topic, but don't worry, I already have a video on it. I might have to remake it someday. It was one of my first videos. But if you look on my YouTube channel, I do have a video entirely dedicated to the development of imagination according to Maria Montessori. So if you're interested in that concept, I'm not going to go into it now, but feel free to look on my YouTube channel and you'll find that video about how we create imagination in the Montessori environment. On page 32, we talk about a little bit more about the germ cell, and Maria Montessori says, for this germ cell, so small as to be invisible, contains in itself the accumulated heredity of all past ages. Within this tiny speck there lies embodied the whole of human experience, all the history which made the race. Montessori goes on to talk about the discovery of genes, both recessive and dominant. If you want to read that a little bit more in detail, feel free. I'm not going to go over it right now, but what I do want to do, I want to go back to the first quote about within this tiny speck there lies embodied the whole of human experience. And what did she mean by that? Well, I have a hard time explaining that. However, I think I found a video that might help a little bit of this. And this is from the Dark Horse podcast with Bret Weinstein. They kind of talked about this phenomenon and how modern science is really discovering what it is that Maria Montessori is talking about here. And we have a special word for this, this pre-memory, and we call it the neme. So there's a word for that in Montessori, and I think that modern science is really just catching up to what it is she's saying here. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to play that video from the Dark Horse podcast. It's a short clip. It's maybe about a minute. So I think you'll find it interesting. I hope you find it interesting anyways.
And then I came across this study that I had to read and check and recheck and check, and it blew my mind. It was they'd been trying to look at upregulation of nasal tissue, the receptors. And so what they were doing was they took male mice and they spritzed cherry scent into the cage and they shocked them at the same time. And as these stories often go, one day there was a sharp graduate student who noted that they forgot to shock them, but they spritzed the cherry scent and the mouse all acted with this PTSD, right? Because they had been habituated to associate the cherry scent with a painful shock. Well, what they found was that the pups from the offspring of those male mice, when they bred them, would display that PTSD behavior upon exposure to the cherry scent, no shock. And then that persisted through multiple generations. So it means that our DNA has a way of taking experiences, saying that sucked, let me help pass that on, coding it up and giving it to our offspring, right? That's not what I learned in evolution, right? That means our DNA is in communication with the world. Now we have this epigenetic, and there's offspring of Auschwitz survivors who have more anxiety. We've got the Dutch studies of the babies that were fasted while they were in utero, gaining weight afterwards. We understand now that our DNA is not this static thing. It's busy in a call and response dynamical process with the world. The complexity of that is not something I can even begin to think we have our arms around.
So I hope you enjoyed that video. I find it absolutely fascinating. And the fact that Maria Montessori had such a creative and scientific mind that she really had this idea that we carried forward this genetic memory is truly amazing. And the fact that modern science is really still catching up to that creativity that she had and that scientific observation and, that intuition, like she knew that there was something that was being brought forward genetically as far as memory goes. And we're still figuring out what it is she was saying. And just the extent to which she was correct about this is really quite fascinating. So I hope you enjoyed that small little clip. I find it absolutely fascinating, but I figured while we are talking about biology, we probably should include a few, well, in here maybe a couple of people who actually study biology. I would love to actually sit down with the Dark Horse podcast and see what their take of Maria Montessori and biology is. I would be absolutely fascinated to have them read through the Absorbent Mind and get their idea of biology and science and modern science. And because I can't evaluate what Maria Montessori said from a biology standpoint. I can't really do much with the information other than be appreciative of it. But somebody in their position who is well educated in the field could really enlighten us to what she's saying and how it fits into modern day science. And that's something, unfortunately, I can't give you. But if I ever have the opportunity to have somebody on this channel to take a modern look at what she was saying in terms of biology, I would love to do that. So I'll keep my fingers crossed that maybe that'll happen someday. But as for today, let's go back to chapter 5 because we have a little more to discuss yet today. And on page 33, Maria Montessori continues talking about genes, and referring to genes, she said, "It is due to these differing combinations that every human being is different from every other." So we see in the same family between children of the same parents innumerable varieties of beauty, physical strength, and intellectual attainment. The science of genes and their combination plays no part in the direct study of what happens after the combining has occurred. It is here that the true biological process of building up the body begins. And then she goes on to describe cellular segmentation a little more. And the only thing I'm going to say is I'm going to just generally say cell division occurs and continues. I'm just going to wrap that up with a neat little bow saying that's what she goes on to talk about in more detail on page 33. If you want to read it for yourself in more detail, go ahead. But that's all I'm going to say for this slide. So let's move on to our next. And on page 33, going on to 34, we have another diagram with some more of our biology information. Maria Montessori says, "The cells are arranged in 3 distinct layers, as if the bricks were being built into walls. What follows is common to all animals. First, the cells form a kind of empty sphere. Then the shell is bent inwards, forming 2 walls opposed to each other. Finally, a 3rd layer is infiltrated between the other 2. And of course, if you look to the diagram on the right, you'll see that this is the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. So she labels all that for you so you can kind of get a visual of what she's talking about. And then she goes on to say, together, they form a tiny elongated body in which all the cells are of equal size, though somewhat smaller than the first cell from which all have come. Each of these 3 walls produces a complicated system of organs. In the outer system, we label these the skin, sensorial, and nervous system. So there's the outer system right there. And on the next page, we're going to get into a little bit more of that, of those systems. So here we are on page 35. We are getting close to the end. I hope you're sticking with me through this. Maybe you love biology and this is easy for you to listen to. If not, hang in there. We're getting close. But on page 35, Maria Montessori says the outer wall is the layer in contact with the outer world, from which the skin protects it, while the senses and nervous system put it into contact with the world. The inner wall develops the organs which provide nutrition. Then there's the 3rd or medial wall, which produces the skeleton. So it's really a nice little trick to remember that that outer wall is what puts us into contact with the outer world. And then that inner wall is those internal organs. And then in the middle, we have that skeleton, right? And then she goes on to say the organs of the nervous system are called organs of relationship because they govern our relationships with the outer world. And this is important. I underline this, I bold it, because we're going to come back to this idea of organs of relationships, systems of relationships. This is something that Maria Montessori goes on to talk about a lot in terms of how we educate children. So I'm not going to go deeply into that right now because it'll come up again later. But just keep that in mind. These ideas of systems of relationships are very important when we're talking about the education of young children. And so then she goes on to describe a little bit more about how the organs develop. If you want to read that in more detail, feel free. Hopefully you have the book. I'm going to just move past that a little bit. And then she describes the ganglia of the nervous system by attributing to them a special degree of sensitiveness. And the reason why I really wanted to highlight this is because the nervous system is a really, really important concept in the Montessori environment, particularly in the 0 to 6 age group, because the children are trying to make sense of their world. And how do they make sense of their world? Well, they experience it. And how do they experience it? Well, they experience it through their nervous system. And if you ever want to understand what's going on with your child between the ages of 0 to 6, a lot of the times I'll tell parents, just look at what their nervous system might be going through. Sometimes it's helpful just to step back and just take a look from the perspective of the nervous system. Perhaps your child has a special sensitiveness to a stimuli. They're trying to understand the world, right? And some children have a little more special sensitiveness to certain stimuli, but also this is how we process the world. And the more we experience the world, the more we're in contact with the world, the more our brain starts to develop, particularly in that 0 to 6 age group. That nervous system in contact with the world is how we developed the brain. It's how the system of relationships going on in the body begin to connect. And I am going to stop there. I'm not going to go into that too much deeper, but this is a really, really important point of Montessori. It's something that really we could go on about forever. And this is also why Maria Montessori has this window of opportunity for learning, the sensitive period for the refinement of the senses. She also has the refinement of movement. Very physical things that put us into contact with our environment. So we have these special windows of opportunity for learning in that 3 to 6 environment, and that really has to go back to that special degree of sensitiveness and the nervous system. So she goes on to say there occurs a specialization by which the cells become suited to do the work of the organs they are building up. Yet this delicate specialization, although it occurs for the sake of a particular function, does so before the function begins to operate. And so this is really interesting, right? Because here the specialization is coming into being, but it happens before the function begins to operate. So we have these organs developing before that function is needed. And from a biological standpoint, that's pretty fascinating. Because a lot of the times, especially if we're thinking from an evolutionary standpoint, and there's different ways to look at this from if you're taking the evolutionary standpoint and you're thinking, well, that's just because we have a history of development that has forced us to create these before the function occurs. And if you're taking this from the standpoint of non-evolutionary standpoint, you can say, well, no, these organs develop before the function begins to operate. And that just goes to show you there's an intelligent design here. And then the function is brought in. So it's really interesting if you're going to argue the two sides. It's really, I don't know, is it the chicken and the egg question again, maybe? I don't know. It's a really interesting thing to think about, but I find that fascinating. But let's pause on that, and we won't go further into evolution on this particular video. So let's move on to the next slide. On pages 36 to 37, we have another type of diagram here, and this goes over the types of cells. And Maria Montessori says, how interesting is this vast difference between the cells? For each has come from the first set, which were all alike. Yet, in preparing themselves for their future missions, they have changed so that each can do something it never did before. But once they are altered, they can never change again. So this is something I find interesting, even though I have a hard time wrapping my head around cells and DNA and all of those terms and ideas. To look at all these, to look at the diagram here and see just how different they are and how different they become. I mean, comparing the nerve cell to the blood cell and just seeing how they function differently, they look differently, they operate differently, and they all came from that first cell, right? That first set, which were alike, and then they start to have a different function. They start to serve with a specialized function, a specialized purpose. Here on page 37, Maria Montessori says, but does not much the same thing happen in human communities? And so right here, she is going to take these biology concepts and she's going to start applying them to communities and philosophy and how society functions. And she does that a couple times through this chapter. So if you're interested in biology, taking biology concepts and applying them to communities and how societies function, you might find this really interesting. She says, as the community develops, work becomes more specialized. Practicing of a profession does not just mean learning a technique. Dedication to it produces inward changes necessary to success. More important than technique is the acquisition of a special personality suited to the work. This makes it a man's own ideal. It becomes the goal of his life. Not only does the developing embryo produce the organs, but also it provides for intercommunication to occur between them, the circulatory and the nervous system. These are by far the most complex of all the organs. Also, they are the only ones engaged solely in uniting the others. So here she starts out with that comparison to a system of biology, and then she goes into the intercommunication between the organs. And we'll come back to this idea at the beginning of the slide where she talks about the specialization for work. I'm going to get to that at the end of this video as well. So we're going to come back to that idea, but I find it very interesting. So hold on, keep that idea in mind as we move forward. On to page 38, and I pretty much have paraphrased this page, and Montessori says of the circulatory system, it's like a river carrying substances to all parts of the body and is also a collector taking in oxygen from the lungs. Blood carries hormones secreted by the endocrine glands to organs in the body. And then she says of the nervous system, it harmonizes the body's total activity. It's like the control room. And then Montessori compares these systems again to how society functions in a similar way with merchants and trades. So again, I'm not going to go too much deeper into that, but if you're really interested in that, give it a read. Take a look at what she has to say. And then on page 39, she talks a little bit more about society, and she says, to rule is the most difficult task of all and requires a higher specialization than any. So there is here no question of election, but of being trained and suited to the work. And so she's going back to this idea of the specialization of the cells, right? Being suited to it, being designed for a specialization. Whoever directs others must have transformed himself. No one can ever be a leader or a guide. And remember, in Montessori, we call teachers guides. Nobody can ever be a leader or a guide who has not been prepared for that work. This principle, which links specialization with function, may well engage our active attention, all the more so as it seems to be nature's way. The plan she follows in all her works. One can see the wonders it brings about in living organisms. And before I read that last quote, I want to go back and revisit an idea in here where she says, no one can ever be a leader or a guide who has not been prepared for that work. And, the work that we do, as teachers, the work we do as guides, the work that you do as parents, it's a specialization, right? And sure, anybody could have that job, but that linkage of specialization with function is really important to success. So sure, we can put somebody in a room who has absolutely no training or has failed their training or maybe hasn't had any experience babysitting before they become a teacher or a parent. We know that this is a very specialized type of work, and so we want to be able to educate people. It's not to condemn people, but it's to say, that specialization is really important. It's important for how the body works, how the body develops, and it's also important in society. And so that's just my 2 cents on that. And being prepared for your work is a really important thing. Earning where you are in your work is a really important thing. And it's a important specialization that you have to go through. You have to be trained and suited to the work. And I just think that is a really important concept. And one of the things I like to see is when a truth is found in many different areas. And so when you start seeing this truth in biology, and then you can see it again in how society works, and you think, well, this is a really deep truth, right? Because we can prove it again in different systems of existence. And I just find that to be a really interesting way to look at work and specialization and how society functions. And then I wanted to end on this quote because she quotes Julian Huxley, and I thought, this is a really great way to end the chapter. And this quote says, "The passage from nothing to the complex body of the fully grown individual is one of the constant miracles of life. If we are not struck by the greatness of this miracle, it can only be for one reason, that it occurs so often under our eyes in the experience of everyday life." And that's pretty powerful, to think that, we've grown accustomed to this miracle to the point where we're not struck by it anymore, right? And just to geek out a little bit more, we started out with sci-fi references at the beginning of the video, so I'm going to end with a musical reference at the end of this video, just to make sure we come full circle on geekdom. And if you haven't picked up on what I've said already, you might know where I'm going with this. There's a musical called My Fair Lady, and there is a song in there saying, "I've grown accustomed to her face." And I think that can be thought of in terms of this quote right here. We've grown accustomed to this miracle. And so we don't really pay attention to it anymore, right? And that's kind of what I think of when I hear this quote. I kind of start thinking of that song, I've grown accustomed to her face, right? At the end there. And so I just thought that's an interesting way to end this chapter of the miracle of creation. Just to remind ourselves, maybe not to grow accustomed to this miracle, right? We need to be struck by the greatness of this miracle. And even though it happens so often in everyday life, it's important to really go back to the beginning. Go back and look at how we really start with nothing. And then we have this one little cell. And then we have this division that happens. And then we have this specialization that happens before the function even begins to occur. And then in that function, everything starts to operate separately. But in that contact with the world, in that experience with the world, all these systems start to come together and connect. And that is what is happening in the 0 to 6 age group in which I teach. And it's absolutely fascinating. And while I'm not a biology nerd, I don't really understand the terms or the ideas really deeply, I do understand that. I do understand the miracle of creation. And I think that is a really powerful way to end this video. So right now, I'm going to say this was chapter 5. I hope you enjoyed it. I will be working on chapter 6 next. And if you like what I'm doing here, if you like what I'm saying, go ahead, give this video a thumbs up, share it with other people who you think could benefit from listening to it. Also, I love to hear your thoughts, so put a comment down below, put a question. Maybe don't put a biology question, I probably can't answer it, but a Montessori question, without the biology, I can probably do pretty well. But anyways, if you have a question or if you have a comment, leave it down below. And of course, if you really like what I'm doing here, subscribe, because I really want to grow this channel. So that being said, I hope you all are having a lovely day, and I will see you in the next video.